This is a very private list. It stands for the 100 thinkers I have selected based on their influence and importance on human thought. Others may have chosen differently, but it was certainly one that had a lot of overlap. All the names on this list will be familiar to anyone who is familiar with Western culture, and most would agree that they should be included. I have used a broad definition of what it means to be a philosopher and have included thinkers from the European and American Western tradition in my list. Some of my selections do not fit the typical, restrictive definition of the word used today. This was intentional. Anyone who has changed the way we think about ourselves, our societies, or our world has a claim to inclusion. If their work has accomplished that, a few scientists who were once referred to as natural philosophers are included. In no way does inclusion on this list imply endorsement. Some of these philosophers lived moral lives, some did not. The pursuit of human happiness has been blessed by some and ruined by others. There are great thinkers in this book, both good and bad, saints and sinners. It is obvious that it is impossible to fully describe each thinker's contribution in entries as condensed as these. Instead, a summary of each speaker's key points, what made their arguments unique and significant, and perhaps a few tidbits about their personalities are presented. It is my hope that readers who are unfamiliar with some of the thinkers whose ideas are presented here will be inspired to read more of their writing and explore the rich repository of ideas that has housed our civilization. The first philosopher is credited to Thales, a native of the Asiatic city of Miletus, an Ionian city. He made assumptions about the nature of what he saw and what reality lay beneath outward manifestations. As a result of his travels to Egypt, where he studied some of their primitive trigonometry, he was able to measure the height of a pyramid by the length of its shadow and gauge the range of a ship at sea using observations made from 2 points on land. According to legend, Thales foresaw the solar eclipse of 585 BC, which caused the conflict between the Lydians and Medes to end and led to their peace treaty. He was one of the 7 wise men, and the adage "water is best" was chosen as his greatest insight. He was not discussing alcohol. Instead, he was discussing the nature of matter. Everything is made of water, according to Thales. He concluded that it was the fundamental component of matter after witnessing it take on various forms, including ice and mist. In his mind, earthquakes were the result of the earth being buffeted by waves and that the earth itself was a floating object. He studied magnetism and discovered that some objects could move toward one another when they were rubbed together and given an electrostatic charge, as we know it today. He categorized magnets as living things with the ability to move objects and concluded that they must possess souls. He established that a triangle scribed within a semicircle must have a right angle and that the constellation Ursa Minor could help with navigation because he was well versed in both mathematics and astronomy. The first careless professor was Thales. After he fell into a ditch while gazing at the stars, a woman remarked that it was impossible for him to know what was happening in the sky if he did not even know what was under his feet. When asked why, if he were so smart, he was not wealthy, Thales replied that he had predicted the next olive harvest would be a bumper one from astronomical observations and had purchased futures on olive presses. To demonstrate that he could profit if he so desired, he leased them out at higher prices when the bumper harvest occurred. He wisely counseled people not to do for themselves that they would accuse others of doing, and referred to as happy the man who was sound in body, resourceful in soul, and willing to learn. The successor to Thales, Anaximander, holds 2 firsts to his name. He was the first philosopher to record his thoughts in writing and the first to create a world map. He was chosen as the head of Miletus's new colony of Apollonia on the Black Sea because he was so highly regarded there. Water cannot contain opposites like wet and dry. He criticized Thales' theory that it can change into other things. Anaximander desired something more all-encompassing, lacking in the traits of anything. He gave it the name apeiron, which translates to the unbounded, or a substance that is not constrained to being any specific thing. It was the original material from which the earth and the heavens were created. Everything, except for apeiron, comes from a source or is derived from a source. There are no opposites in its original, undefined form because they are all connected. The emergence of opposites occurs only after division into separate components. The unbounded substance from which everything originates will eventually give rise to everything else. In the interim, opposites encroach on one another to make up for the injustice of that initial separation. Anaximander postulated that the earth was like a drum, with people inhabiting the top surface and its height being 1/3 of its diameter. This explains how the horizon is circular, how we appear to live on a flat surface, and how celestial bodies pass below it. Being at the center and having no reason to move in any direction, the earth is unsupported, according to Anaximander. After calculating the distances of the sun, moon, and stars, he hypothesized that a large fire, which was visible through holes in the wheels and contained the sun, moon, and stars, was responsible for the moon's phases and eclipses. The earth was once covered in water, but Anaximander believed that it had begun to dry out, and that creatures had begun to appear because of the sun's action on wet mud. Given how vulnerable we are today, humans must have been protected earlier in our aquatic evolution and came from the mouths of enormous fish. He believed that, like fish, humans once had spines on their skin. Along with his accomplishments as a cartographer, Anaximander also dabbled in meteorology, attributing thunder to clouds colliding. He brought the gnomon, vertical sundial, to Greece and used it to measure time and the equinoxes. He rejected mythological explanations for what happened in favor of naturalistic and logical ones, like the other Milesian philosophers. One of the greatest thinkers ever to have lived, Pythagoras, is best known to schoolchildren for the theorem that bears his name. He is said to have traveled to Egypt and Babylon before opening a school in Croton, a Greek city in Italy. He was born on the Greek island of Samos. His ideas are entangled in the myths that surround the man and his followers. He noticed that the musical notes produced by pulling on a string vary proportionally to its length, just as those produced by striking an anvil vary proportionally to its size. He concluded that mathematics underlies all reality and that mathematical ratios are at the core of musical harmony. The true reality, which can be described by mathematical formulae, lies behind the imperfect world we observe. All objects fall under this. The longest side of the right-angled triangle, whose shorter sides are 3 and 4, is 5. Pythagoras demonstrated what the Babylonians already knew: the square on any right-angled triangle's long side equals the sum of the squares on its shorter sides. According to Pythagoras, figures such as these determine the shape of an actual object. Pythagoras asserted that mathematics not only controlled everything on earth, but that even celestial bodies moved according to musical harmony ratios, producing the celestial music of the spheres. Up until their shapes and forms were quantified by numbers, things were a part of the unbounded. Pythagoras believed that people are driven by the desire for gain, honor, or wisdom, and his followers led disciplined, monastic lives to achieve wisdom. This required avoiding meat and beans and adhering to stringent rituals that included smoothing out the depressions left by a pot in the ashes or a body covered in bedclothes. In life, an equilibrium was sought between opposites like hot and cold or wet and dry. His perspective was not a blend of the scientific and the mystical. His adherents shared property and lived in communal settings while accepting women as equals. Similarly to Aristotle, Pythagoras thought that all living things had immortal souls that underwent reincarnation in subsequent lives. Many of the ideas found in Plato's writings, such as the idea of a perfect reality beneath imperfect appearances, the three motivational forces behind human behavior, the idea of reincarnation for the soul, and the virtues of a contemplative, simple life had their beginnings with Pythagoras. Although it is unlikely that Pythagoras had the golden thigh that legend attributes to him or that he was able to project writing on the moon by reflecting it off a mirror, he was still regarded as being of godlike stature. The famous 5th century BC author Xenophanes of Colophon, who lived during a time of upheaval, said he spent his life being tossed about Greece. Despite this, he lived to a ripe old age and left behind elegant poetic fragments that expressed a philosophy in which his insights can seem remarkably contemporary. He was one of the first to look for natural explanations that matched physical forces to our observations rather than accepting God's arbitrary acts as the cause of the universe's events. He established the Eleatic school of philosophy, among whose pupils were Parmenides. Xenophanes proposed the idea of a single supreme deity who was unlike humans in form or nature, round, eternal, and unchanging. He saw before fewer but that people give their gods human characteristics. He claims that Thracians give theirs red hair and blue eyes while Ethiopians give them a flat nose and black color. However, if cattle, horses, and lions could draw, their gods would resemble them. Additionally, Xenophanes derided Homer and Hesiod for promoting moral depravity by depicting gods with human vices like theft, adultery, and deceit, which are incompatible with divine goodness. He advised writers to only use credible sources when describing the existence of gods. As a social reformer, Xenophanes wrote about appropriate drinking behavior, unnecessary luxuries, and the excessive honors bestowed on athletes. Fish fossils found inland led Xenophanes to the conclusion that water once covered the earth and that different combinations of water and earth were the origin of all other things. Because he saw clouds as a stage in the transition from one state to another, Xenophanes gave them a special importance. He believed that they had been lifted by the sun's rays into the surrounding air and that the moon served as a 101 Great Philosophers, a compressed version of the sun, which was made up of burning clouds. Like how he attempted to explain other natural occurrences, he did not equate nature with God but saw it as limitless, homogeneous, and eternal. He considered the subjective and deceptive nature of human perceptions, such as how men would perceive figs as sweeter in the absence of honey as a counterbalance. There is truth, but men cannot know it, they can only guess at it. Men can learn things that might resemble the truth by searching, but as for certain truth, no man has known it, nor will he know it. Because everything is only a woven web of assumptions, even if man were to accidentally reveal the ultimate truth, according to Xenophanes, he would himself not know it. This is consistent with the modern understanding of science as a collection of speculative hypotheses that cannot all be proven to be true. Mr. H., who lived and wrote between the years 535 and 475 BC in Ephesus, was a member of the school of Greek philosophers known as the pre-socratics because of their writings on topics other than those that Socrates addressed. Instead of focusing solely on human goodness and virtue, many of them struggled to explain what the universe was all about, why it took different shapes and forms, and whether there was a deeper reality beneath appearances. The long-lasting effects of Mr. H embraced change and made it the center of his philosophy, in contrast to most of his close contemporaries who sought the consolation of permanence amid chaos and uncertainty. His book on nature is lost, but from quotations used by other authors we can still get a clear sense of his worldview. Everything is changing, he assumed. We step into the same rivers and do not step into them. He was trying to make the point that even though we still refer to the river as the same one, there are now new waters in its place. Everything is constantly changing in Mr. H's world. The sun is brand new every day, and we are not the same people we once were. The Milesian philosophy, which held that something must be what it is, or it does not exist at all, was in opposition to this. Mr. H argued that this was false because things evolve over time. The unity of opposites is at the heart of his theory. He explains that the opposites of day and night, winter and summer, and war and peace are all equivalent in that the way up and the way down are the same. He does not mean that the opposites are simultaneously identical, but that they are constantly morphing into one another. As night gives way to day, day follows night. Night would not exist without the day. There will never be an end to the conflict between opposites, and no one will ever completely dominate the other. Cosmic justice is being served through their conflict, and conflict is the source of all progress. All things are in interchange for fire, according to Mr. H., who believed that fire is the first element and the source of all the others. The most honorable men had more fire in their souls than base water, even in men. Mr. H embraced war as father and king, determining men's social standing. War is the epitome of conflict. He had no patience for traditional politics, saying that his compatriots should be hanged, and he preferred playing games with kids to being in the spotlight. He did not want the Persian king to give him any favors because he detested luxury. He may have been viewed as an archetype of melancholy for a long time because of these characteristics. Though little is known about Parmenides' life, it is known that in his 65th year he met and had an impact on the young Socrates. There can be no denying his influence on the intellectual landscape. He was the first in an extensive line of philosophers who used logical and linguistic arguments to draw conclusions about the outside world, conclusions that did not rely on observation and frequently ran counter to it. Only 150 of the many thousands of hexameter verse lines that Parmenides wrote have been preserved. In his essay on nature, he describes being driven through the gate of night and day by a goddess in a chariot. She demonstrated for him the distinction between the way of truth and the way of opinion, and Parmenides presents the justifications for this division. He asserts that something must exist for us to be able to think about it and discuss it. Otherwise, he claims, we cannot think about it. For us to be able to think about the future, things that we can think about in the past must still exist as they did then. Thus, Parmenides concludes that change is illusory and that things will always remain as they are. Additionally, because nothing comes from nothing, that which could not have come into being. As a result, reality is eternal and unchanging in Parmenides' view. It is also consistent. The universe must remain constant throughout because motion is illusory because there can never be a void between objects. He informs us that it is a static, undividable sphere. Parmenides presents the opposing perspective of a more comforting permanence in which nothing changes in response to Mr. H's assertion that everything has changed. He asserts that the universe is a single, constant entity that has existed throughout time and will continue to do so. Cannot reveal this to us. Only pure reason, or logos, can reveal the truth to us. Parmenides concludes that the universe is a substance rather than a process. Its shape may appear to change as things are created and destroyed, but the substance from which they are made lasts forever, and their various appearances are merely a part of that fictitious world of opinion. The basis of Parmenides' argument is that words have a fixed, constant meaning, but this is not how people use words. Fewer people now believe that words can confer immortality on objects on their own because their meaning changes over time.